You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking with John Flynn, who in the past has worked as a journalist in Paris, London, and Berlin, but right now he is the president of an organization called AARO, the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. John, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I should point out, although I was president until very recently, I am now a vice president of my organization.
Okay, so we'll give you the same honor due to a president, however.
Well, thank you.
Tell us a little bit what AARO does.
Right. Well, the Association of Americans Resident Overseas has been working for close to 40 years now in defending the rights and privileges of Americans who live overseas. We are based in Paris. We have about 1,000 members and I think a total of 34 countries now. There are actually 2 in Israel. We're a non-profit and non-partisan organization whose job is basically to help educate Americans living abroad about the various problems that they might be facing and the ways that they can solve it, to advocate in Washington and with members of the administration and the legislature about ways that the problems might be fixed, and to also just generally serve Americans living overseas. We have, for example, a medical insurance program, which is very helpful to many of them. Some of them are already covered by the local health insurance programs in the countries where they live, but others are not. And our health insurance program will cover both those situations.
Okay, that sounds like quite a big agenda. So you've been around for about 40 years. What are some of the success stories from AARO? Well,
when we were started in 1973, there were 2 really major issues at that point. The first was voting. Americans simply did not have the right or the ability to vote from overseas until 1976. We and some of our allied organizations worked very, very hard to rectify that problem, because it was absurd that Americans living overseas should not have the right to exercise this very fundamental right. We worked very hard and were able to get through the Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Rights Act in 1976, which was the fundamental act which took away the problems. That was amended in 1978 so that there was no longer any possibility of state and local taxes being applied to Americans simply because they were voting from overseas.
Sorry, so that's eliminated now? You're saying that if an American, when you register to vote, even when you're living overseas, don't you still have to register through some jurisdiction?
You vote in the voting area, the district where you last resided in the United States, and you have to send in a request for an absentee ballot to that jurisdiction, that is the state local voting officials, asking for an absentee ballot. But the problem that arose very early was in the 1970s, some people were concerned, quite rightly, that if they asked to vote in that state, that the state would then apply state and local taxes to them. So this was amended in 1978 to bar that from happening.
Isn't there some fear that people talk about? I've heard it discussed that if you vote, or let's say you keep your driver's license from your old jurisdiction, that let's say either you'd be subject to tax when you're alive, or if you were to die, then the state might claim a state tax, even though you didn't actually live there. They would say, see, the driver's license, for example, is proof of your having residency here.
Well, it has become de facto a sort of national ID card, but the state cannot claim anything from your estate if you die. There might be U.S. estate taxes applied at the federal level, but as far as I know, state and local municipalities cannot take any of that simply on the basis that you voted in that district. We've also had another problem that very early on, which was simply citizenship for children that were born abroad of Americans married to a non-American. This has been resolved to a large extent, but there are still problems that arise because of that. In 1978, for example, after a great deal of work by AARO, it abolished what had been a 2-year residence requirement for children born abroad, that they had to live between the ages of 14 and 28 in the United States. That was abolished in 1978. Then in 1986, we had the Citizenship Reform Act, which reduced the residency required for the U.S. parent. There had been a requirement that parent had to live for 5 years, 2 of them after the age of 14, in the United States in order for the child to have U.S. nationality. So that was 2 of the things that were very important for our organization, and where I think we had a great deal of success.
Okay. We are talking with John Flint, who is the former president of AARO, the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. He's now the vice president. He's been explaining to us some of the successes that the organization has had in the past. One of the very big issues that's being spoken about now is some of the new tax legislation that seems to people living overseas, and I speak on behalf of many clients. You know, my day job is that I'm a financial advisor. I deal mostly with Americans who've moved to Israel, and they're finding that the reporting requirements, to say the least, of their Israeli bank accounts are onerous and very difficult. Where are we going with this? Is the U.S. government really trying to discourage people from leaving the United States?
Well, the problem goes back to a simple fact that the United States is, for all practical purposes, the only country in the world that taxes its citizens on the basis of their citizenship and not on the basis of their residence. Every other country, if someone moves to a different country, lives in that country, obviously that person will be paying taxes in the new country of residence, but is no longer required to pay taxes to the country of birth or previous citizenship. America is the only country, practically, I think Eritrea is another one, but it's basically the only one which insists that Americans, for their entire lives, no matter where they live, have to file tax returns and, in some cases, actually pay taxes. Now, recently, what has happened is that as a result of possibly of 9/11, but more really because of the fallout from the UBS scandal in Switzerland, where Congress discovered that a certain number of Americans had Swiss bank accounts which they were concealing and not paying taxes on. This has led to new legislation which has become increasingly burdensome and difficult for Americans living overseas. For example, there has been for a long time the report of foreign bank and financial accounts, which is usually called the FBAR report. It's Form 90.22/1, you know about it. That's been around since 1970, and it basically requires anybody who has foreign financial and bank accounts above $10,000 in any particular year to file an account to the Treasury on that. The penalties, by the way, are officially rather severe for non-willful declaration of those accounts. It can be up to $10,000. For willful refusal to file that, it can be the greater of either $100,000 or 50% of the account, with possible criminal actions. Now, in reality, almost none of these penalties has, to my knowledge, ever been applied. I don't know anyone who's got hit by that. But that requirement has lately been much more carefully looked at, and it's people who have more than $10,000 in foreign bank accounts and financial accounts should really be careful that they do send that in, because the IRS is becoming much more vigilant in doing that. Now, beyond that, in the last couple of years, we've had the real problem which has come up, which is the Foreign Accounts Tax Compliance Act, known as FACTA from its acronym. This was slipped in almost almost surreptitiously into the HIRE Act, H-I-R-E, the HIRE Act of 2010, which was designed to increase employment. Now, as a result of this FACTA account, the IRS has produced this year Form 8938, which is called the Statement of Specified Foreign Financial Assets. This is a much more complicated and much more detailed form, which in fact duplicates to a great extent the FBAR.
Right. And you mail it to a different address too, right?
And it has to be mailed. It has to be mailed with your tax return. It doesn't get sent to the Treasury in Detroit as the FBAR does. It is supposed to be attached to and mailed with your actual tax return. Here, now, for those, there are different thresholds for this, but since we're talking to and about Americans who live overseas, I can just say that if you're living abroad but not filing a joint account, you're required to fill this out if you have $200,000 in those accounts at the end of the year, or $300,000 at any time during the year. If you are living abroad and filing a joint account, here the threshold rises. It would have to be $400,000 at the last day of the year, or $600,000 at any time during that year. So that's complicated, but the penalties here again are very severe, up to $10,000 for failure to disclose, with an additional $10,000 for each 30 days of non-filing once the IRS sends you a note saying, where is this form?
Do you think that as a result of all of this sort of onerous reporting requirements and the risk of penalty, that we're going to see more Americans who are living outside the United States who don't really intend to move back, sending back their passports and giving up their citizenship?
Well, there has been an increase in the number of Americans who have deliberately renounced their U.S. citizenship. Last year, on the last figures, there were 1,800 people around the world who turned in their American passports and said they no longer wanted to be citizens. We have to assume that a large part of this is due to this extremely onerous and complicated tax filing requirements, because in fact, even the IRS people to whom we have spoken here in Paris admit that they would have great difficulty in filling out these forms.
Well, if they're living in Paris, they probably have to fill them out for themselves, too. We're talking to John Flint, who's the current vice president and former president of the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. John, it's actually very interesting, but I'm sorry, we're just about out of time. Tell me, how can people learn more about your organization?
Well, it's very simple. The best way to do it would be to look at our website, which is www.aaro.org, there's arrow.org. There's an enormous amount of information on this and many other topics on that website. If you want to get in touch with us, you can also email us at AARO, AARO at AARO.org. It's our email address. And we would be delighted to have you as members. We are, as I said, a totally non-profit organization and rely only on the dues of our members to keep going. But I think we were able to to do a great deal for Americans overseas, both by lobbying in Washington. We send a delegation practically every year to Washington to talk to people on the Hill about the problems that we've just discussed. And if people want to know more about it, I suggest the first thing to do is to look at our website, and they'll find a great deal of information on it.
Okay, John Flint from the Association of Americans Resident Overseas. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Doug, for having us.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.